And for now, I'm going to hand over to Robin, who has the power of screen share and is going to share some presentation slides with us.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Yes, I was anticipating that there would be, well, I was working on the assumption that most people would be relatively familiar with Housing First as a program, and that what I would need to do would be to start out explaining what the PIEs framework is, what the whole approach is about, and then how we can use this with Housing First. So in the presentation I haven't done a lot of describing Housing First itself, except insofar as it comes up in the course of the presentation. So that may be a weakness. If we need to come back and cover some of that, well, Alex is probably the person to answer those questions. So let's go first to the screen that I have here. And here is going to be the presentation that I was hoping to run. Now, I'm hoping that this will take maybe 15, probably 20 minutes, but I built in a couple of breaks where we can ask questions as we go along. So the question for me is, oops, hold on. Is there a natural fit between PIEs and the PIEs framework and the Housing First way of working? The previous two conversations we've had seem to suggest that people do see them as working very well together, but wanted to go into it a bit more just to see how this works. So here I'm going to start out describing the PIEs framework itself. The images here will explain. Then looking at Housing First practice in these terms, in terms of the PIEs 2 framework. Then I want to look at how we can hopefully use the PIE framework to develop the practice of Housing First insofar as it works as a psychologically informed environment, because we have a process for developing PIEs which should, I would hope, work with Housing First services. I've not been able to do any kind of research or poll, so anecdotally I hear that a lot of Housing First services are finding this useful, but I think we need to tease out a bit more what it is that works and what we need to work on a bit more to get more out of it. If there's time at the end, I happily talk a little bit and answer any questions about the software version of this Pizazz process, which has come out just in the last 3, 4, 6 months or so, which allows us to share practice across a much wider community, not just people in a room or on a Zoom meeting, but much broader. But whether we can get time for that, I don't know. We'll have to see how it goes. So first, for those for whom PIEs is still quite new or quite confusing, let's look at the PIEs framework itself. The way we think of it currently, the PIEs 2 framework, which is an update of the version that came out around 2010 or so, has 5 main areas that we suggest that you look at your service in these terms. And these are, oh, hold on. The thing to stress, though, is that although we have these 5 areas, underneath them all, underlying everything, is the importance of the relationships that you form. Relationships are the main tool that you have to work with. This is what we are hearing from all those services that are starting to work in this way, that relationships runs through everything, like Brighton through a stick of rock. I'm sure there are other metaphors, other places selling rock, I'm sure, are available. So on the understanding that relationships are central to all of this, we start out with what we call psychological awareness. And that's the first of the 5 key themes. The second, staff training and support. One of the key issues here was that that staff need support as well as your service users need support when you are aware of the complexity of the emotional challenge involved in this kind of work. The third area we call learning and inquiry. This is really about how you think about your services, how you can develop as a learning organization that's new, that's constantly seeing challenges as an opportunity to learn and develop, rather than as something to be controlled and contained and minimized. We talk of a cycle of practice-based learning with a framework, staff training, development, publishing, research and practice, and so on. The next area is the actual day-to-day management of your service, which we call the 3 R's, which is rules, roles, and the overall flexibility of the responsiveness. 3 R's is just a well-known phrase in English, and so we shoehorned those nouns into it to some extent. But effectively, it is how your service operates on a day-to-day basis, the actual practice, the operational procedures, and so on. And then finally, the perhaps most sophisticated concept of all, the spaces of opportunity. This is about how people move through your service. If psychological awareness is about how you understand your users, and training and support, how you train and support your staff, and learning and inquiry is about how you organize the attitude almost within the organization itself. Spaces of opportunity. This is for those services that do have a building, whether it's a refuge, a day center, an access hub, or whatever. It's how the building itself is designed, the lighting, the signage, and so on. But also it's where your building, when you have one, how it's located in the surroundings, in the immediate area, where it is physically, bus routes, but also how near are you to things like local parks, coffee bars and places where ordinary people meet and socialize. The kind of networks of housing that we sometimes find in move-on accommodation would come under this, surroundings and networks. And they're an important part of enriching the sense of living in a community. And that also then takes us into how people come to your service and how they move on from it. So it's how you move through your service for those who move through. And that takes us on to looking at the extent to which there is a really effective ecosystem of all the different services and partnerships working in your area, and any gaps, any barriers, any thresholds that are particularly difficult for your client group, and what you can do about them. So those are the areas that we can look at, the 5 main practice areas. And the key thing to point out here is that this is a holistic model. It's about how it all works together, how it all hangs together. It is a systemic framework. It's a single framework that we intended, hoped, would apply to all complex needs services, so that we would all be using a common language in terms of what we're trying to do, singing from the same hymn sheet, effectively. And that's a pretty big ambition, especially when you're looking at complex needs and complex services, let alone complex partnerships and so on. But that balance of focus and flexibility is what we were aiming for with the overall PIES approach. It is a way of looking at your services so you decide for yourself what you want to do. It's a lens, not a list of things to do. There's no tick box that you can tick on and say, oh, we've got to do that, and then we're applying. Done, fine. But what the framework allows you to do, hopefully, is look at each element in its own right and then see how it fits within that broader picture. To get such a single framework, such a big picture of such a complex area, we had to make compromises, inevitably. And some of that language, in order to cover all the areas we needed to cover, is fairly abstract. It's fairly, it needs a bit of kind of customizing. You need to tease out what it means in your particular situation. And what we tend to find is that it works best if there's an individual within your agency as a whole, or particularly a champion perhaps within each particular service, who's a bit more familiar with it and who can help you work out how you apply this in your particular setting. So the need, something very general has to be customized. The alternative would be to have about 50 different models of how you all work together, and that's not going to help you to work to get together. So that's why we went for such a big picture approach. So that is the framework as a whole. Probably best illustrated, though, in practice by looking at each of those areas in turn. And I'm going to be looking in particular at how you can apply this framework to issues in Housing First. We talk of having a psychological model. That's in inverted commas because it doesn't necessarily mean something from psychology. It's about understanding people, thinking of people as people. And essentially that image that looks rather like a brain, your classic neuroscience picture of a brain, look at it more closely and it's actually a fingerprint. Because this is actually about people. It's about who you are as a person. It's about recognizing the individuality of each individual person. And essentially that includes your staff, not just your service users, customers, clients, whatever you want to call them. So coming from whatever psychological understanding of what makes people tick that you work on, there are a number of techniques of engaging people. The more you're working with people who are vulnerable to marginalization, exclusion, and so on, the harder it is you have to work on engaging people and finding learning ways to do that, which we then need to share. Underneath all that, though, is the issue of what we've called emotional awareness. You can call it empathy, you can call it compassion, you can call it sensitivity, but it's basically about just how humans relate to each other and care about and for each other. Without that, none of the others are going to work. So that is, to my mind, the baseline of psychological awareness, rather than any particular techniques or any particular theory that you may use. So it's not all technical, and a lot of it is about using ordinary language. And I think when you're working in a Housing First environment, you need to talk to a lot of other people who are living in the same area, working in the same area, working in different roles in different parts of the service. Finding an ordinary language way to describe what you're trying to do is a lot better than having a lot of technical terms that just can blind people. So I'm hoping that that shift may work particularly well with Housing First services, granted the kind of community integration side of your work. That said, my sense of it is that the strengths model basically says we are working to help people build up their strengths and find their own strengths, makes sense in ordinary language. The recovery model taken from drug and alcohol initially, well, over the pandemic era, we all probably drunk more than we would wish we had. So the idea that people are struggling with recovering from alcohol is maybe pretty intelligible to anybody. The one technical word that I would suggest that we do use a lot is trauma and trauma awareness. Many people will be familiar with trauma-informed care. Trauma is a word that makes sense to everybody. You don't need to have all the neuroscience of plasticity and amygdala and endorphins and so on, all that blinding with science stuff. As soon as you start talking about trauma, people can relate to that straight away as, oh yeah, it's what's happened to you in the past. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. That word changes the whole language and changes the framework. So it is one bit I would particularly suggest. I'm going to rattle on now to training and support. Well, one of the key things about the PIE's approach was we started talking about staff needing support in the work they're doing, training and all those techniques and models and so on. I think the one thing that's important with Housing First, perhaps, is that as well as supporting your own staff, you may have a role in supporting others. The ones who have a bit more skills and knowledge around working with clients with greater difficulties and presenting greater challenges to work with, is that they are often the ones best able to help others understand what happened, what went wrong, and so on. So supporting others as well. In other words, the question is, who do you regard as staff? Is it just the staff of your own service, or is it the staff of all the different services and partnerships and agencies that you may be working with to work together at the local level? And of all those, peer support is really emerging as one of the most effective ways to provide support for individuals and even to do training with other groups. When you have service user or former service user coming out and doing a training day with a local housing department or whatever. It's magic the difference it can make. So peer support and using peer work and lived experience workers is a really, really valuable part, it seems to me. We put it under training and support. It could also come up under the different roles that you have when we get to the 3 R's, which we're not going to do yet because we're first going to go on to learning and inquiry. 4 main areas that we identified as being particularly effective in services that were working in this kind of way. The first is reflective practice, just thinking about what happened, not just reacting to difficulties or even things that have gone really well, but thinking about it a little bit, sharing and talking it over with other people. We often see people introducing reflective practice groups, but reflective practice isn't just something that happens in a group. The group encourages, but hopefully reflective practice is something that becomes just part of the way we learn to work with the clients. That does, though, require an attitude within the organization, which we've called a culture of inquiry. It's actually a term taken over from sociotherapy in therapeutic communities in the 1950s. But it means that the organization as a whole supports learning from what works and how to tackle difficulties in a proactive kind of way. The organization as a whole needs to have that attitude. It needs to run through the whole service, through the whole agency. That said, an awful lot of the really valuable learning about what works and where we fit and what's happening in the world outside comes from talking with colleagues outside, what we call sector engagement. So if you can, the more staff you're able to send to a local meeting which is discussing problems of drugs and alcohol in this town, or problems with the benefit system, or whatever, the more you're able to get involved in those discussions at local level, the richer your sense of where your service is within the whole. And when you can write that up, when you can sort of contribute to something which is not just a local discussion, but a broader understanding of how we develop this area of work, this we've called evidence generating practice. Housing First is evidence led, but it's also evidence generating. The early days of Housing First were all based on studies of what happened in the United States. We're now doing some fairly different things. And you need to use a lot of creativity to apply the Housing First principles in practice. What we now need to do is to learn how to share and to learn from that stuff. It's not quantifiable, it's much more a matter of discussions and conversations and forums and so on. But this is, it seems to me, the kind of maturation of the Housing First approach. As for the 3 R's, I'm gabbling a little bit here to try and get through it all in time. Alex, let me know if I'm going too fast or too slow. Rules, roles and responsiveness. Rules includes the procedures, the operational practices, all the things that you get in the rule book, but not just in your own rule book. When you're looking with a Housing First service, it may be the rule books of other organizations, the housing department, the housing management, the housing options teams, certainly things like Social Security when you're looking at ways to speed up the process of getting claims. So in other words, you want to be quite proactive in looking not just at your own rules that may need to change somewhat to work with a client with particular difficulties, but also you may want to look at the procedures of other organizations. You can do that, of course, as part of that sector engagement thing that we've done before. You see how it's a holistic model, they all kind of work together. Roles, I mentioned peer support as a role. There are also all kinds of informal roles that people have in a natural community. And I think it's really important to be aware of that and work with that, respect and appreciate when people are stepping outside of their formal role and doing things that are more personal. And that's as true of service users as it is of staff. And it's as true of staff as it is of service users. Responsiveness is all about really being person-centered. These are the things that aren't in the rule book. This is more like the kind of the nitty-gritty of day-to-day interactions where you just have to make it up as you go along. That's where a lot of the creativity lies. And as I see it, as I've said, I think you need a lot of creativity in the Housing First services. I'm going to rattle us on through, though, to the spaces of opportunity, because this is one of the key areas. We were talking originally about the built environment, meaning hostels, day centres, the building that you owned and therefore could manage and run differently. And then the surroundings and networks working with, do you have all of your key worker sessions within the hostel, or will you sometimes go out and have a walk in the park with somebody, or have a session in a coffee bar, and the actual normal environment around that people can use, and the networks when you have move on accommodation and so on. This area, surroundings and networks, is trying to look at how a service with a building is located in a wider area. In Housing First, you haven't got the building, or at least not the central building. What you have is people's own home. But there are ways that we can learn to try and help people feel at home. Homemaking as a skill is again something I think we need to share, learn from. And I mentioned the pathways and the gaps in services. I suppose the thing to do is to say, if the built environment is your own home, pathways and gaps is about the coherence of the system as a whole. And there's a lot of general feeling around, I think, at the moment, that we have systemic problems that cannot be addressed by one individual service, let alone by one individual worker. And we have to be tackling the coherence or the lack of coherence of the systems as a whole, at local level and even at national level. So there you have the PIEs framework as a whole, and there you have how this may apply and how you can use this in Housing First. But the question I want to ask is, okay, we can identify a lot of housing practice within the PIEs framework. How useful is it really? If it covers most, maybe not all, issues, does it actually help to do so? And spoiler alert, because we're going to have a bit of a pause now in case people have got questions you want to ask about what we've had so far. I'm going to suggest that one way that the PIEs framework maybe helps us advance Housing First practice is to use the self-assessment, structured services self-assessment and development process that we developed for PIEs generally. But we can come on to that next. First, I want to pause and check with Alex if there's people who have particular questions that you feel we need to pause and address before we rattle on Pizazz approach. So how might it actually help is where we stopped when I was saying, if we can use the Pizazz with Housing First, and the Pizazz is a structured process of services self-assessment and self-development. I stress self because at one point, 5-6 years ago, people were saying, perhaps we ought to have some kind of accreditation for whether you are a proper PIE or not. I was totally opposed to that. I thought the last thing you want to do is move the power away from services and learning from the front line to some other body. It would get so bureaucratic and formulaic and so on. And you'd have to have an appeals procedure because you would lose the contract if you didn't get your accreditation. No, what I wanted was self-assessment and internal self-development, and sharing practice and learning between agencies. So let's look at the Pizazz, which is the process that we then developed to take this forward. As an acronym, it is the PIEs self-assessment and service specification. There's your Pizazz. It's S's rather than Z's, but as you may have gathered, what we wanted was not the actual words, it's the word Pizazz. It was about identifying, stressing, appreciating the buzz that you get in services that know they're doing good work. It's really fulfilling work that's challenging but exciting and so on. So dictionary definition from Thesaurus: liveliness, vivacity, zip, zing, energy, oomph, wallop, jazz, enthusiasm, pep. This is what people go to work for that kind of flair, buzz in the work. You don't go to work in order to increase the number of outcomes that your service has achieved in, over a sort of 2-year period to make your contract. That's not what motivates people. That's not what brings the best out of people. It's when you've got something going on. And if we can capture that and bottle it, then we're doing something really valuable. So the Pizazz, the PIEs, self-assessment and service specification or service development process, comes now in 2 formats. There's a Pizazz on paper, And there's the computer, the on-screen version, which we call the PIElink for reasons I can explain if you want to know. To explain it and to run through it, it's simpler just to go to the paper version. That's what people are more familiar with. We published the paper version probably about 4 years ago on the PIElink, the community practice site that I mentioned earlier. We'll come back to and show it later. It's been downloaded, last time I looked, about 700 times. Now, it doesn't mean it's been used 700 times. Some people might have downloaded and thought, oh, can't do with this at all. Or of course, the fact that it's been used and downloaded doesn't mean it was only used once. You can use the Pizazz again and again and again as a recursive process of looking again at your service. Some people will run through the whole thing every few months or so, just say, well, where are we now? So it is on paper, so you print out the 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 sheets, and it's worth mentioning it's entirely free. The paper version, software version, because it's software, you have to get a license, but the paper version is entirely free, and it's going to remain so. I do not want anybody, any service, to be unable to afford to be party to this. There's a soup kitchen down in South London run by volunteers. I want everybody to be able to use this process, singing from the same hymn sheet, using the same language. So we start out on those pages with an introduction, just explaining what the Pizazz approach is all about. And if you have a look there, psychological awareness, staff training and support, learning and inquiry, you know that. These are all the categories or the themes and the areas that we'd spelled out before. So this uses the same model that I had explained earlier on. And it takes us then through 5 stages: step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4 and 5. And that is the structured process of starting from where you're at and then looking at where you're going. So it's a service development, not just a service assessment. You start out that printed sheet, psychological awareness, staff training, support, there they all are. And notice the columns along the right: poor, early, progressing, or advanced. This is a self-assessment within a team, within a service, of where you feel you're at, how much progress you're making, where you think your strengths and weaknesses are. So you start out with an initial view based on a discussion within the team. And you then come up with, using those different levels of progress, an approximate score for where you think you're at. The score is not the important thing. I do have to stress this again and again. It's not a competition. This is all about where you want to go, not whether or not you've achieved some goal. It's a long jump rather than a high jump to continuously be improving. So this is how people are using it, putting a cross in one or other of those columns. You can see that under early, for example, you've got 3 different possible levels: the very beginnings of early stages, kind of in the middle, doing quite well, not quite into the area there is actually a handbook that describes roughly what all these levels might look like in your case, but of course you have to apply that in each different setting. So there's your initial assessments. Then step 2, why do you say that? What makes you say this is where you feel you're at? What evidence would you give for saying, well, we're doing quite well here, or we're not doing so good in this area? That's the discussion within the team. And that's the important part, because that's what then leads on to a discussion of, well, you know, granted this and this that we are doing, and this that we aren't doing, what's helping and what's hindering, what's holding us back, and what have we got that we can build on? You can call it a SWOT analysis for those who are familiar with strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Basically, it's a stage here in this flow through from where you're at to what evidence you would give, what you're doing and what you're not doing. But from what helps and what hinders, from your factor analysis that allows you to set priorities about what you think you need to address first, you then go on to your action plan. Okay, what will you do now? And here we have all those areas, so you can write in there, you can use post-it notes, you can blow up the whole thing and give everybody in the team their own individual sheet to write their own version and then pull them. You can use it in whatever way works for your particular setting. Again, it tries to be as flexible and open as possible. So that's what you'll do now. And then the final stage that we introduced to this is talk it over with somebody else. If you have 2 or 3 services run by the same organization, why not get them to talk to each other about how they see what each other is doing? It's a peer support for services. Sometimes you'll get a service which is really way out on its own, a day centre in Cumbria. But they could talk with, say, the local vicar or a primary school, anywhere that's actually familiar with these. It doesn't even need to be in the same sector. It doesn't need to be in the same geography, because you could actually just share these, send them out to people, type them out and so on. So talk it over with somebody else is a really good way of finding. Other people will often say, actually, I think you've been a bit too harsh there. We do find that people tend to be a bit timid and a bit inhibited about saying the things they're good at, and very, very reluctant to admit that actually some people are doing really, really well in some areas. I know 1 or 2 places that I think are way down the line, really doing brilliant work, and they regard themselves as still on the journey, which I guess is true because everybody is. So that is the paper version. Those 5 or 6, 5 stages, 7 or 8 actual sheets of paper that you can print out. And like I say, it's completely free. And you'll find the whole thing on this community of practice website, the PIElink, www.pielink.net. I'm sure we can, Alex and I can send out some details. There's a picture of me there, just talking about it all. I do updates every year or so. And if you have a look there, that banner here, the home page, the basics, pretty much the stuff that we've been through already. PIEs in practice, those ideas applied in particular settings. A whole string of discussions, including here the forums that we mentioned that this conversation today arose out of. I think we're going to have a forum on housing first in the Pizazz. That allows people to go into it in a lot more detail. That's probably something we can do in the spring. So, but then when you get to Pizazz in the PIE, because click on there, I can't do this because this is a slide, that will take you through to where the Pizazz on paper is. And some people we know have, as I said, you post-it notes, flip charts. I don't know how to get hold of flip charts these days. I'm afraid in the internet age, they seem to have disappeared. I wanted to get an actual one, but this is 80s, as you can tell from the not terribly fashionable trousers that the woman is wearing. Flip charts have largely disappeared. So people can give their evidence, or they can also propose their ideas about what's the factor analysis, what's helping and what's hindering. You can put all of these together, pool them all together, connect them up in whatever ways works for you. And we know some people have then posted the whole thing on a wall in the office and used it as a kind of continuous reminder of where we're at and where we're trying to go. Although it is a holistic model, with all those 5 themes teasing everything out, there's no reason why one agency could not say, we've got 50 services all over the country, we're worried about staff support. The pandemic has been a really, really hard time for us all. But by all means do a whole rounded assessment, but let's all particularly focus on staff training and support, or just on staff training, not just on staff support. So you can use it quite flexibly depending on where you're at as a service at any point in time. Because workplace mental health, after all, is a major concern for us all. So if we can use the Pizazz as a process of services self-assessment and self-development, then it seems to me that this is a way of getting all housing first services teasing out what is working for them. And you can share that practice with others. At this point, it's really helpful to look at some point at the software version, because sharing lots of pieces of paper, let alone a whole string of post-it notes, is going to be a bit awkward, it's going to be a bit cumbersome. Whereas the software version, because it digitizes effectively your assessments and so on, means that you can share it across a much larger area. So we can come on to the PIElink later, because it has got all kinds of bells and whistles. It's really quite exciting, I think. But let's not go there yet. The main thing, I think, is what do you think of that idea of the 5-stage process, the different levels of success or whatever? I would love to hear from Housing First services that have actually used the Pizazz. I mean, Anthony in Wales was saying they have, but I could really do some feedback as to whether or not this really gets to the point, or whether there are bits that we need to tweak a little bit more to make it more useful, specifically for Housing First. Should we have a version of this which is more focused on Housing First issues, that brings them out more? We have a handbook which you could run through, which kind of explains. Perhaps we could tease that out a bit more and just say, in Housing First, this is what we kind of mean by these particular issues, and these are the things we suggest you look at. Something we'd have to do together. It's not something that I think I could do on my own. It's very much a community practice, collective effort idea, but that is at least where we're at the moment.
Thanks, Robin.
Alex, over to you.
I haven't seen any questions in the chat, so I'll just open it up if anyone wants to just unmute